The year was 1996, and the quaint town of Elmwood, nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, seemed like the perfect place to live a quiet life. Known for its close-knit community and picturesque streets, Elmwood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. Beneath the town's serene facade, a storm of deception and darkness brewed, destined to shock even the most seasoned investigators. At the heart of this story was Rebecca Hartley, a woman who epitomized the perfect suburban wife, or so it seemed. With her soft blonde curls, gentle demeanor, and charming laugh, Rebecca was the kind of woman neighbors trusted without hesitation. She was married to Thomas Hartley, a hardworking and mild-mannered accountant, who seemed to be everything Rebecca could have wished for in a partner. The couple had been together for almost 15 years, and to the outside world, their relationship was the definition of stability. Thomas was a man of habit. Every morning he would leave their modest brick home at exactly 7:15 a.m., coffee thermos in hand, and return promptly at 6 p.m. Rebecca, meanwhile, worked part-time as a librarian at the local community center. Her life seemed to revolve around her home, her husband, and their 12-year-old daughter, Emily. To neighbors and friends, the Hartleys were the embodiment of the American dream. But perfection often masks imperfection. Beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form in their seemingly solid marriage. Thomas, ever the analytical thinker, had noticed subtle changes in Rebecca over the past year. Her once bright eyes seemed distant, her laughter more forced. She had become withdrawn, spending more time alone, often giving vague explanations for her whereabouts. When he asked, Rebecca would brush off his concerns with a dismissive wave and an easy smile. "Don't worry so much, Tom. I'm just stressed from work," she would say as she hurried to change the subject. But Thomas's instincts told him otherwise. He wasn't the type to pry, yet something gnawed at him. As weeks turned into months, Rebecca's behavior became more erratic. She frequently returned home late, sometimes past midnight, claiming she had been catching up with friends or attending book club meetings. She seemed distracted, even nervous, glancing over her shoulder whenever they were out in public together. Thomas tried to dismiss his suspicions, telling himself he was imagining things, but he couldn't ignore the growing knot of unease in his chest. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a chilly evening in late November when Thomas stumbled upon the first clue, a single crumpled receipt tucked into the pocket of Rebecca's coat. The receipt was from a high-end restaurant in a neighboring city, dated the previous Friday night. But Thomas knew Rebecca hadn't mentioned going out that evening. In fact, she had told him she was staying late at the library for inventory work. His mind raced. Who had Rebecca been with? Thomas tried to confront her, but Rebecca was quick to deflect. She accused him of being paranoid and overly controlling, her tone sharp and defensive. It was the first time Thomas had seen a glimmer of hostility in her otherwise gentle demeanor. He backed down, more confused than ever, yet unwilling to let the matter go. A week later, his suspicions were confirmed. One of Thomas's co-workers, James, mentioned seeing Rebecca at the very same restaurant from the receipt, except she wasn't alone. According to James, she had been dining with a man, someone Thomas didn't recognize. Thomas's world began to crumble. He couldn't fathom the idea that Rebecca might be unfaithful, yet all signs pointed in that direction. Determined to uncover the truth, he decided to follow her. On a crisp December evening, Thomas tailed Rebecca as she left their home, claiming she was going to a charity event. He kept a safe distance, his heart pounding as he watched her car wind through the streets of Elmwood and onto the highway. Eventually, she pulled into the parking lot of a dimly lit motel on the outskirts of town. Thomas's chest tightened as he parked a few cars away, watching her disappear inside. Minutes later, a man emerged from a black sedan and followed her in. Thomas sat in his car, paralyzed by a mix of fury, heartbreak, and disbelief. Who was this man? And what was Rebecca doing with him? The answers he sought would come soon enough, but not in the way he expected. Unable to confront Rebecca directly, Thomas hired a private investigator, a grizzled veteran named Frank Dawson. Within days, Frank uncovered what Thomas had feared most. Rebecca was having an affair. The man she was meeting at the motel was Michael Travers, a local contractor with a reputation for being a smooth talker and a ladies' man. Thomas felt as if his world had shattered into a million pieces. He spent sleepless nights agonizing over what to do. Should he confront Rebecca? Should he file for divorce? But before he could make a decision, tragedy struck in a way no one could have anticipated. One cold January morning, Thomas returned home from an early run to find police cars and an ambulance parked outside his house. The front door was wide open, and neighbors stood huddled on the lawn, whispering in hushed tones. Inside, Rebecca lay sprawled on the kitchen floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. The serene town of Elmwood was about to be thrust into the spotlight as investigators unraveled a chilling web of lies, betrayal, and murder that no one saw coming. The shocking events that followed would haunt the community for years to come. Rebecca Hartley's death sent shockwaves through Elmwood, turning the once sleepy town into a bustling hub of police cars, journalists, and curious onlookers. For a place unaccustomed to serious crime, the sight of investigators swarming the Hartley home was unsettling, almost surreal. Behind the yellow tape, seasoned detectives combed through the house, meticulously documenting every detail. It wasn't long before it became clear that Rebecca's death wasn't the result of a random act of violence. The lead investigator, Detective Claire Montrose, had seen her share of domestic crimes. But there was something different about this case. The crime scene was oddly clean for such a brutal act. Rebecca had been stabbed multiple times, yet there was little blood spatter outside the immediate area. It suggested a deliberate and calculated attack. The positioning of her body, on her back, arms outstretched, hinted at something personal, perhaps even symbolic. Thomas Hartley was inconsolable. When the police first arrived, they found him on the front lawn, clutching his daughter Emily in his arms. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he answered the officer's initial questions. He claimed he had been out jogging when the attack occurred. According to him, Rebecca was alive and well when he left the house at 5:30 a.m. But Thomas's alibi raised more questions than it answered. For one, why had he left the house so early, especially on such a bitterly cold morning? And why did he look so disheveled when he returned? Witnesses confirmed that Thomas had been seen jogging, but the timeline was tight, too tight for comfort. Detective Montrose knew better than to jump to conclusions, but her instincts told her there was more to Thomas's story. She pressed him for details about his relationship with Rebecca, and that's when cracks began to show. She'd been distant lately, Thomas admitted, his voice breaking. I think she was seeing someone else. This revelation sent ripples through the investigation. If Rebecca had been unfaithful, it introduced the possibility of another suspect, her lover. But it also cast suspicion back on Thomas. Had jealousy driven him to murder his wife? As the investigation unfolded, the spotlight shifted to Michael Travers, the man Rebecca had been secretly meeting. Michael was quickly identified and brought in for questioning. A ruggedly handsome contractor in his early 40s, Michael had a reputation for charming women, often to the detriment of their marriages. At first, Michael denied any involvement with Rebecca, but under pressure, he admitted to the affair. We were just having fun, he said with a shrug. It wasn't serious. Detective Montrose wasn't convinced. If the affair wasn't serious, why had Michael been spotted at the Hartley home on multiple occasions while Thomas was at work? And why had Rebecca's phone records shown a flurry of calls and messages to Michael in the days leading up to her death? The turning point came when investigators discovered a hidden compartment in Rebecca's jewelry box. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to Michael. In it, Rebecca confessed her love for him and her desire to leave Thomas. She wrote of feeling trapped in her marriage and longing for a fresh start. The letter painted a picture of a woman torn between two worlds, the safe, predictable life she shared with Thomas and the passionate, unpredictable connection she had with Michael. It also raised an unsettling question. Had Rebecca planned to leave her husband only to pay the ultimate price for her betrayal? Meanwhile, forensic evidence began to tell its own story. The knife used in the murder was a kitchen knife, wiped clean of fingerprints but missing from the Hartley home. Blood analysis revealed that Rebecca had been killed shortly after Thomas left for his run, placing the time of death around 6 a.m. Despite the mounting evidence, the case was far from straightforward. Witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts. Some claimed to have seen a man matching Michael's description near the Hartley home on the morning of the murder. Others reported hearing raised voices coming from the house the night before. The most damning piece of evidence, however, came from an unexpected source. Emily. The 12-year-old had been asleep upstairs when the murder occurred, but she told detectives she had heard something unusual around 5:45 a.m. Her mother arguing with a man. "It didn't sound like Dad," Emily said, her voice trembling. "It was someone else. He sounded angry." Emily's statement cast doubt on Thomas's involvement, but it also raised a chilling possibility. Had Michael confronted Rebecca in a fit of rage after learning she was having second thoughts about their relationship? Michael vehemently denied being anywhere near the Hartley home that morning. He claimed he had been at his apartment, preparing for a construction job across town. But his alibi fell apart when surveillance footage surfaced, showing his car parked a few blocks from the Hartley residence around the time of the murder. Confronted with the evidence, Michael's demeanor shifted. He became defensive, accusing the police of targeting him because of his reputation. "I didn't kill her," he insisted. "Yeah, we had an argument, but I left before anything happened. She was alive when I walked out that door." Detective Montrose wasn't buying it. Michael's story was riddled with inconsistencies, and his fingerprints were found on the motel receipt Thomas had discovered weeks earlier. But there was still no direct evidence tying him to the murder. As the investigation dragged on, the pressure mounted. The media had caught wind of the case, dubbing it the Elmwood Betrayal. Reporters camped outside the Hartley home, hungry for updates. The town was divided, with some residents convinced Thomas was guilty, while others believed Michael was the true killer. Through it all, Thomas maintained his innocence. He cooperated fully with the investigation, even volunteering to take a polygraph test, which he passed. But the emotional toll was evident. He had lost his wife, his reputation was in tatters, and his once close relationship with Emily was strained. "I just want justice for Rebecca," he told Detective Montrose during one of their interviews. "Whoever did this, they need to pay." Then in a surprising twist, a new piece of evidence came to light. A neighbor's security camera had captured a shadowy figure entering the Hartley home through the back door around 5:50 a.m. on the morning of the murder. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to suggest that the killer had premeditated the attack, using the rear entrance to avoid detection. The figure's build was consistent with Michael's, but without a clear image, it wasn't enough to secure an arrest. Frustrated but determined, Detective Montrose continued to dig deeper. Her persistence paid off when she uncovered a series of text messages between Rebecca and an unidentified number. The messages hinted at a third person involved in the affair, someone Rebecca had confided in about her plans to leave Thomas. This new lead opened a Pandora's box of possibilities. Could Rebecca have been killed by someone else entirely? Someone with their own motives? Or was this third person merely a pawn in a larger game of deceit and betrayal? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was certain. The closer investigators got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. As the investigation deepened, Detective Claire Montrose and her team found themselves tangled in a web of secrets more complex than they had imagined. The new lead, the series of texts exchanged between Rebecca and the unidentified number, opened up an entirely new line of inquiry. Who was this third person, and what role had they played in Rebecca's tragic demise? Using advanced phone tracking methods, the number was traced to a woman named Laura Grayson, a name unfamiliar to both Thomas Hartley and Michael Travers. Laura, a local bartender in her early 30s, lived on the outskirts of Elmwood. When detectives visited her home, Laura seemed nervous but cooperative. "I knew Rebecca," Laura admitted, her voice shaky as she clutched a steaming mug of coffee. "She'd come into the bar sometimes. We talked." Detective Montrose pressed further. "What did you talk about, Laura?" "Her marriage," Laura replied, glancing at her feet. "She told me she wasn't happy, that she was seeing someone else. She said she felt trapped." Laura's statements matched what investigators already knew, but she hesitated when asked if she knew about Michael Travers. "I met him once," Laura finally said. "He came to the bar with Rebecca. They argued. It got heated. He said something about her needing to make a choice, about being tired of waiting." This revelation painted Michael in an even darker light. It suggested he had been pressuring Rebecca, perhaps even threatening her. But Laura also added another layer to the story. Rebecca wasn't just afraid of Michael, she said. She was scared of her husband. The room fell silent. She told me she thought Thomas was starting to suspect something, Laura continued. She said he'd been acting differently, watching her closely, asking questions. She was afraid he'd do something if he found out about the affair. These statements complicated the case further. It was now clear that Rebecca felt trapped, not just by her marriage, but by her affair as well. Both men had motives, and both had shown patterns of behavior that raised red flags. Detective Montrose left Laura's house with more questions than answers. The possibility that Thomas might have known more than he let on couldn't be ignored. Montrose decided it was time to re-interview him, this time focusing on his knowledge of Rebecca's affair and his whereabouts on the morning of her death. When confronted, Thomas's calm demeanor began to crack. "I suspected something," he admitted. "She was distant. I found the receipt and I knew, but I didn't kill her. I loved her despite everything." Montrose leaned forward, her gaze steady. "If you didn't kill her, Thomas, then who did?" Thomas hesitated, his hands trembling. "I don't know. But if you think I could hurt her, you're wrong. I wanted to fix things. For Emily's sake." Despite his emotional plea, Montrose couldn't ignore the inconsistencies in his story. His alibi was thin, and his initial reaction to finding Rebecca's body seemed almost rehearsed. Still, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. The investigation took another turn when forensics revealed a breakthrough. A partial fingerprint had been lifted from the knife handle, and while it wasn't a full match, it was enough to rule out Thomas Hartley. The print belonged to Michael Travers. When confronted with this evidence, Michael's cocky demeanor evaporated. "All right, yes, I went to the house that morning," he confessed, his voice trembling. "But I didn't kill her. I went to talk to her. She'd been avoiding me, and I needed answers. But when I got there, she was already dead." Michael claimed he had panicked upon finding Rebecca's lifeless body, touching the knife in a moment of shock before fleeing the scene. His explanation was plausible, but Detective Montrose wasn't convinced. "Why didn't you call the police, Michael?" she asked pointedly. "I was scared," he shouted. "I knew how it would look. The affair, the arguments. I knew I'd be the first person they'd blame." Michael's confession complicated the case even further. If he had found Rebecca dead, it suggested there might be a third party involved, someone who had arrived before him and carried out the murder. But if that was true, who was this third person? And what was their motive? The answer came from an unexpected source: a discarded burner phone found in a dumpster behind the motel where Rebecca and Michael had met in secret. The phone, once traced, revealed a series of chilling messages exchanged between Rebecca and an anonymous number. The messages hinted at threats Rebecca had received in the weeks leading up to her death. One in particular stood out: "If you don't end it, I will." The tone was menacing, and the timestamp placed it just 3 days before Rebecca's murder. Further analysis of the phone's data led investigators to another shocking discovery. The anonymous number was linked to Laura Grayson. When Detective Montrose confronted Laura with this evidence, the bartender broke down. "All right, I sent the messages," Laura admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But I didn't mean to scare her. I was trying to protect her." "Protect her from what, Laura?" Montrose pressed. "From herself," Laura sobbed. "She was making a mess of her life. She didn't know what she wanted. She was hurting everyone around her. Thomas, Michael, even Emily. I just wanted her to stop before things got worse." Despite her emotional confession, Laura denied any involvement in the murder. But her statements raised yet another possibility. Had Laura, in her attempt to protect Rebecca, crossed a line? The case reached its climax when surveillance footage from the motel was re-examined. The footage showed not only Rebecca and Michael meeting, but also a shadowy figure lingering near the parking lot on multiple occasions. After enhancing the footage, investigators identified the figure: Laura Grayson. Faced with this evidence, Laura finally broke. "I didn't mean to kill her," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to talk. I went to the house that morning to convince her to stop seeing Michael, but she wouldn't listen. She got angry, said I had no right to interfere. We argued, and I lost control." Laura claimed the stabbing was an act of passion, not premeditation. She had grabbed the knife from the kitchen in the heat of the moment, striking Rebecca in a fit of rage. When she realized what she had done, she panicked and fled. leaving the back door unlocked in her haste. Her confession brought the case to a tragic close. Laura was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During her trial, she expressed deep remorse, but her actions had irrevocably shattered multiple lives. For Thomas Hartley, the resolution offered little solace. He had lost his wife, his daughter's trust, and the sense of normalcy he had once taken for granted. Michael Travers, though cleared of murder charges, faced public scrutiny and the collapse of his business. Elmwood, too, would never be the same. The small town that prided itself on its sense of community now bore the scars of betrayal, loss, and the dark secrets lurking behind closed doors. In the end, Rebecca's death served as a grim reminder of how fragile human relationships can be and how devastating the consequences of betrayal can become.
"Evelyn!" David's voice boomed through the hallway, raw with anger and desperation. "I know you're in there. Open the door!" Evelyn stood paralyzed, her mind racing. Claire, her own fear mounting, tried to pull her away from the door. "Don't you dare open it!" she hissed. But Evelyn, trembling, felt a wave of guilt and fear. "He'll break it down," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The banging grew louder. "Evelyn, I just want to talk." David's tone shifted, the anger giving way to a chilling calmness. "If you don't open this door, I'll make you listen one way or another." Claire stepped in front of Evelyn, her eyes blazing with determination. "Stay here," she said firmly, before moving toward the door. "David, you need to leave," she called out. "This isn't the time or place." But David was beyond reasoning. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he snapped. "This is between me and my wife." Claire refused to back down. "She's not coming out, and you need to go before this gets worse." Her voice was steady, but inside her heart was pounding. David's reply was the deafening sound of a gunshot. The bullet splintered the wooden door frame, sending shards flying into the apartment. Evelyn screamed, and Claire pulled her behind the couch, both of them ducking for cover. "David, stop!" Evelyn cried, her voice breaking. "Please, don't do this!" But David was relentless. He kicked the door open, his face twisted with fury, the gun shaking in his hand. "You think you can run away from me?" he shouted, his eyes darting between Evelyn and Claire. "You think you can just throw me away like trash?" Claire, shielding Evelyn, tried to reason with him. "David, put the gun down. You don't want to do this." But her words only seemed to enrage him further. "You don't get to tell me what I want," he spat. "You took everything from me. Both of you." Evelyn, tears streaming down her face, pleaded with him. "David, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Please, let's just talk." But her words fell on deaf ears. David raised the gun, pointing it at Claire. "You," he said, his voice trembling. "You're the reason she changed. You poisoned her against me." Time seemed to slow as the tension reached its breaking point. Claire, sensing the danger, stepped forward, her hands raised. "If you're going to blame someone, blame me," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But leave Evelyn out of this." David's hand wavered, his resolve faltering. In that moment of hesitation, Evelyn lunged forward, grabbing his arm. The gun went off, the deafening sound reverberating through the apartment. Claire screamed as Evelyn and David struggled for control of the weapon. Another shot rang out, and David staggered back, blood blooming across his chest. He fell to the floor, the gun clattering beside him. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by Evelyn's sobs as she knelt beside David. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands shaking as she pressed them against his wound. "David, stay with me. Please, stay with me." Claire called 911, her voice trembling as she relayed what had happened. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Evelyn cradled David's head, tears streaming down her face as she whispered apologies. David's breathing was shallow, his eyes glazed with pain. "I just wanted it to stop," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I couldn't take it anymore." The police arrived moments later, followed by paramedics who rushed to stabilize David. Evelyn and Claire were separated and questioned, their shock evident in every word they spoke. The aftermath was a blur, a cacophony of flashing lights, police radios, and the weight of what had transpired sinking in. David was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The news sent shockwaves through Ashton Grove, shattering the quiet community's perception of the Harper family. Gossip spread like wildfire, each retelling more sensational than the last. Evelyn and Claire, though spared legal consequences after the investigation determined the shooting was an act of self-defense, were left to grapple with the emotional scars of that night. Evelyn, haunted by guilt, struggled to reconcile her role in David's downward spiral. Claire, though supportive, found their relationship strained under the weight of their shared trauma. In the months that followed, Evelyn made the difficult decision to leave Ashton Grove. "There's too much here," she told Claire. "Too many memories. I need a fresh start." Claire, though heartbroken, understood. They parted ways, both carrying the weight of their choices and the tragedy that had unfolded. Ashton Grove eventually moved on, its streets once again filled with the hum of daily life. But the memory of that fateful Christmas lingered, a chilling reminder of how love, betrayal, and despair can collide with devastating consequences. The Harper tragedy became a cautionary tale, whispered in hushed tones, a story of passion turned to heartbreak, and a warning of how easily the line between love and destruction can blur.